Here is a dangerous idea that almost nobody wants to hear: intelligence does not automatically make you wiser. In fact, for a very long stretch of the journey, intelligence can make you more blind. Most people assume ignorance is the enemy. They assume the more knowledge you gain, the closer you move toward truth. But what if the opposite is often true? What if knowledge, before it becomes wisdom, first becomes pride? And what if the greatest obstacle to transformation is not a lack of understanding, but the belief that you already understand? This is the hidden mystery behind one of the most powerful symbols in Journey to the West: not a character, not a battle, not a supernatural feat, but a furnace. Not a furnace as a machine. A furnace as an archetype. A furnace as a psychological test. A furnace as a spiritual mirror. Because the question is not what the furnace burns. The question is what survives it. And that question matters far more today than most people realize. Think about it. We live in an age overflowing with information. More books. More podcasts. More courses. More experts. More opinions. At no point in human history has knowledge been so accessible. Yet anxiety grows. Division grows. Ego grows. People know more than ever, and somehow many of us struggle to understand ourselves. Why? That contradiction should bother us. Because if knowledge alone created wisdom, our world should look very different. Instead, we often see another pattern emerge. The more someone knows, the harder it becomes for them to admit they might be wrong. The more successful someone becomes, the more painful humility feels. The more recognition someone receives, the more tightly they cling to the identity they have built. Knowledge expands. But so does the self. And that is where the furnace appears. Not as a place. Not as an event. But as a symbol. A symbol of pressure. A symbol of exposure. A symbol of transformation. Or perhaps more accurately, a symbol of attempted transformation. Because here is the first revelation. Pressure does not necessarily change you. Pressure reveals you. A person under pressure does not suddenly become arrogant. They reveal arrogance that was already there. A person under pressure does not suddenly become fearful. They reveal fear that was already hidden. And a person under pressure does not suddenly discover their ego. They discover how much of it survived. That image is worth remembering. A giant furnace blazing with unimaginable heat. Everything appears to be melting. Everything appears to be changing. But somewhere inside, something remains untouched. That is our first memory fragment. The furnace burns. The ego survives. And suddenly the question becomes much more uncomfortable. What if suffering itself is not enough? Many people believe hardship automatically produces growth. But history, psychology, and spiritual traditions all point toward a more complicated reality. Some people emerge from hardship wiser. Others emerge more bitter. Some become compassionate. Others become more rigid. The same fire. Different outcomes. Why? Because transformation does not begin when pain arrives. Transformation begins when illusion leaves. And that leads us to another memory fragment. A person can survive every external challenge and still remain trapped by an internal one. That is not merely a spiritual idea. It is a human one. We see it in boardrooms. We see it in universities. We see it in politics. We see it in self-improvement culture. We even see it in spiritual communities, where people can become deeply attached to being seen as enlightened. The trap evolves. The ego adapts. The illusion survives. Which raises an even deeper mystery. If intelligence can become pride, if knowledge can become identity, if suffering alone cannot guarantee transformation, then what exactly is the furnace trying to reveal? And more importantly, what is the one thing inside us that refuses to burn, no matter how hot the fire becomes? If the furnace exposes what already exists inside us, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Why is pride so difficult to remove in the first place? Most people think pride is the opposite of weakness. But psychologically, that is rarely true. Very often, pride is weakness wearing armor. It is the mind's attempt to protect an identity it is afraid to lose. And that changes everything. Because now the furnace looks different. It is no longer merely a symbol of pressure. It becomes a symbol of exposure. The exposure of attachment. The exposure of identity. The exposure of the hidden contract we make with our own self-image. In Buddhist thought, attachment is rarely limited to possessions. People become attached to beliefs. Attached to achievements. Attached to intelligence. Attached to virtue. Attached even to their own suffering. And perhaps the most dangerous attachment of all is attachment to the person we believe we are. That is where the real conflict begins. Not between knowledge and ignorance, but between knowledge and identity. Because knowledge is useful. Identity is addictive. And when the two become fused together, transformation becomes extraordinarily difficult. Think about what happens whenever someone's deepest beliefs are challenged. The emotional reaction often arrives before the logical one. Defensiveness appears. Resistance appears. Anger appears. Why? Because the threat is no longer directed at an idea. The threat is directed at the self. That is the hidden contradiction. People often imagine that intelligence makes a person more open-minded. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it creates the opposite effect. The smarter the mind becomes, the more sophisticated its defenses become. The ego learns new vocabulary. It learns philosophy. It learns psychology. It learns spirituality. And then it uses those tools to protect itself. This is the psychological reversal that many people never see. The obstacle is no longer ignorance. The obstacle becomes identification. Knowledge stops being a bridge. It becomes a fortress. And that image deserves to stay with us. A scholar sitting inside a castle built from books. A seeker trapped inside a prison made from spiritual concepts. A successful person carrying trophies that slowly become chains. That is our next memory fragment. The prison is not built from failure. The prison is built from success. The deeper symbolic layer is even more unsettling. Fire transforms only what is willing to change form. Metal placed into a furnace must surrender its previous shape before it can become something new. But human beings often want transformation without surrender. We want growth without uncertainty. Wisdom without humility. Awakening without loss. And yet every spiritual tradition points toward the same paradox. The self that wants enlightenment may be the very thing standing in the way of it. Not because ambition is evil. Not because intelligence is dangerous. But because the mind quietly turns every achievement into evidence of its own importance. This pattern extends far beyond individuals. Look at institutions. Look at corporations. Look at governments. Look at cultures. Entire systems can become trapped by their own success. The very strengths that once allowed them to grow eventually become the reasons they cannot evolve. What begins as wisdom hardens into dogma? What begins as confidence hardens into arrogance? What begins as order hardens into rigidity? The pattern repeats at every scale. Individual. Community. Civilization. And that scale shift reveals something important. The furnace is not only personal. The furnace is collective. Every generation enters its own furnace. Every society enters its own furnace. Every age is eventually forced to confront the difference between what it knows and what it truly understands. Which brings us closer to the mystery. Perhaps the furnace was never designed to destroy pride. Perhaps its purpose was something far more uncomfortable. Perhaps its purpose was to reveal how deeply pride had rooted itself inside the structure of identity. Because something strange happens whenever illusion is exposed. Exposure does not automatically create freedom. Sometimes exposure creates resistance. Sometimes seeing the truth makes people cling even harder to the illusion. And if that is true, then another question emerges from the fire. If the furnace can reveal the ego but cannot remove it, if awareness alone is not enough to create transformation, then what is the missing element that turns exposure into genuine awakening? Before we ask what creates awakening, we may need to confront a far more uncomfortable possibility. What if part of us does not actually want to awaken? Not because we love suffering. Not because we enjoy illusion. But because awakening threatens something that the ego considers sacred. Control. This is where the archetype of the furnace becomes even more paradoxical. A furnace is usually associated with transformation. We imagine raw material entering one side and something refined emerging from the other. The process appears straightforward. But human consciousness does not behave like metal. Metal does not argue with the fire. The ego does. And that introduces a contradiction that sits at the center of human nature. Most people say they want truth. Yet when truth threatens identity, certainty, status, or self-image, many people choose comfort instead. Not consciously. Not maliciously. But instinctively. Because the mind has a hidden priority that often outranks truth itself. Psychological survival. This is the deeper shadow function hidden inside the furnace archetype. The ego is not merely seeking importance. The ego is seeking continuity. It wants to remain the same self tomorrow that it was yesterday. It wants stability, predictability, recognition, a coherent story. And every genuine transformation threatens that story. This creates a crisis that most people never recognize. The greatest resistance to change rarely comes from the outside world. It comes from the version of ourselves that believes it is protecting us. That is the next memory fragment. The jailer and the prisoner are often the same person. And once you see that, another layer of symbolism emerges. The furnace is not simply exposing pride. It is exposing attachment to identity itself. Pride is only the symptom. Attachment is the root. This distinction matters because many people spend years fighting symptoms while protecting causes. They attack arrogance while secretly preserving superiority. They reject status while becoming proud of humility. They abandon material success while becoming attached to spiritual success. The shape changes. The attachment remains. And that is why the conflict keeps escalating. Because the ego is not a fixed object. It is adaptive. It evolves. It learns. It disguises itself. Sometimes it appears as ambition. Sometimes as victimhood. Sometimes as intelligence. Sometimes as morality. Sometimes as spirituality. This is one of the most important reversals in Buddhist philosophy. The obstacle is not always desire for worldly things. Sometimes the obstacle is desire for enlightenment itself. The self begins chasing awakening as another achievement. Another trophy. Another identity. Another reason to feel separate. And suddenly the path becomes the trap. Think about how often this appears in modern life. People build careers to prove their worth. Then become trapped by those careers. People build expertise to gain freedom. Then become imprisoned by the need to be right. People build personal brands to express themselves. Then become unable to change because thousands of people expect them to remain the same. The pattern repeats everywhere. The stronger the identity becomes, the harder transformation becomes. And when that pattern spreads beyond individuals, its consequences become enormous. Entire organizations become unable to evolve. Entire institutions become unable to admit mistakes. Entire societies become attached to stories about themselves. The result is predictable. Rigidity replaces learning. Certainty replaces curiosity. Dogma replaces wisdom. This is where the scale suddenly shifts. The furnace is no longer testing a person. It is testing civilizations. History repeatedly shows that collapse often begins long before external failure appears. The deeper collapse occurs when a system loses the ability to question itself. When self-correction disappears. When identity becomes more important than truth. That is why the symbolism of fire becomes increasingly mysterious. Fire destroys. But it also reveals. Fire removes what cannot endure. Yet there is one thing that repeatedly survives. The narrative self. The story we tell about who we are. And here the mystery deepens again. Perhaps pride was never the final problem. Perhaps pride is only the visible surface of something much older. Something much deeper. Something that survives intelligence. Survives success. Survives suffering. Survives even spiritual practice. Because if attachment to identity is the real force hiding beneath the furnace, then the question is no longer why pride survives. The question becomes far more unsettling. What if the thing resisting transformation is the very self that believes it is seeking it? If the self that seeks transformation can also resist transformation, then we arrive at a revelation that changes the entire meaning of the furnace. The furnace is not primarily a tool of destruction. It is a tool of diagnosis. That distinction is easy to miss. Most people imagine spiritual growth as the gradual accumulation of something valuable. More knowledge. More discipline. More experience. More understanding. But the symbolism hidden within the furnace points in a different direction. Its deeper function is not addition. It is exposure. Not revealing what you know. Revealing what still controls you. This is why the furnace occupies such a powerful archetypal role. It stands between illusion and awakening. Between identity and reality. Between the self we perform and the self we actually are. And the most important thing it reveals is not strength. It is dependency. What can you not afford to lose? What must remain true for your identity to survive? What belief, achievement, reputation, or image have you quietly turned into a psychological necessity? These questions matter because dependency creates invisible gravity. A person may appear free while orbiting a hidden attachment. A person may appear wise while protecting a fragile identity. A person may appear transformed while still being governed by the same unconscious center. That is the next memory fragment. A golden crown can become a chain. Not because the crown is evil, but because the mind forgets it can be removed. The deeper insight here is profoundly uncomfortable. Human beings often assume suffering is proof of growth. Yet suffering is merely pressure. Pressure reveals structure. It does not automatically change structure. A bridge under stress reveals its weaknesses. A civilization under stress reveals its weaknesses. A human mind under stress reveals its weaknesses. The revelation is simple. What emerges under pressure was already present before the pressure arrived. And that changes how we view the entire process of transformation. The real question is not whether the fire is strong enough. The real question is whether awareness is deep enough. Because awareness changes the role of suffering. Without awareness, suffering becomes repetition. With awareness, suffering becomes instruction. Without awareness, pain hardens identity. With awareness, pain loosens identity. The external experience may look identical. The internal outcome becomes completely different. This is where Buddhist philosophy introduces a subtle but critical shift. The goal is not to defeat the self. The goal is to see through the illusion that the self is fixed. The shadow function of the ego depends upon permanence. It survives by convincing us that we are the same thing we were yesterday. The furnace reveals something else. Everything changes. Thoughts change. Beliefs change. Emotions change. Roles change. Bodies change. Entire civilizations change. Yet the mind continuously searches for something permanent to hold onto. And that search creates attachment. The attachment creates fear. The fear creates resistance. The resistance creates suffering. Notice how different this is from ordinary self-help culture. Most modern systems focus on building a stronger identity. Build confidence. Build influence. Build expertise. Build status. Build a personal brand. There is value in these things. But the furnace introduces a question most systems avoid. What happens when the structure you spent decades building becomes the very thing preventing further growth? At the level of an individual, this creates stagnation. At the level of institutions, it creates dogma. At the level of civilizations, it creates decline. That is the scale shift hidden inside the symbol. The furnace is not merely examining a person. It is examining every structure that mistakes permanence for truth. A company. A religion. An ideology. A nation. Even a worldview. All of them eventually encounter the same test. Can they adapt when reality changes? Or are they too attached to what they once were? That image becomes another memory fragment. A magnificent temple standing untouched for centuries. Not because it is eternal. Because nobody has questioned its foundation. And now we approach a deeper layer of the mystery. Perhaps the furnace never existed to reveal arrogance. Perhaps arrogance was only the visible symptom. Perhaps it was always pointing toward something beneath pride, beneath knowledge, beneath identity itself. A hidden attachment so fundamental that most people never notice it. An attachment not to success. Not to intelligence. Not even to reputation. But to the belief that there is a permanent someone who owns all of those things. And if that is true, then the mystery changes completely. The question is no longer what survives the fire. The question becomes far stranger. What if the thing we have been trying to protect all along is the very illusion the furnace was designed to expose? If the furnace was designed to expose an illusion rather than destroy an enemy, then we can finally ask the question hidden beneath every other question. What was the illusion? The answer is far more radical than most people expect. The deepest illusion was never pride itself. Pride was only the visible shape. The deeper illusion was ownership. The belief that wisdom is mine. The belief that power is mine. The belief that knowledge is mine. The belief that achievement is mine. The belief that identity itself belongs to a permanent owner. And this is where the true symbolic meaning of the furnace finally reveals itself. The furnace represents the collision between reality and ownership. Reality is fluid. Ownership seeks permanence. Reality changes. Ownership resists change. Reality moves. Ownership wants to hold. The conflict was never between intelligence and ignorance. The conflict was between attachment and reality. This is the core revelation. Knowledge does not create suffering. Power does not create suffering. Achievement does not create suffering. Attachment to them creates suffering. The same intelligence can become wisdom or arrogance. The same success can become service or vanity. The same spiritual path can become liberation or another prison. The determining factor is not what is possessed. It is whether the mind believes it owns what it possesses. That is why the furnace occupies such a profound role within the architecture of spiritual psychology. It is not a symbol of punishment. It is a symbol of non-ownership. Everything entering the furnace is forced into uncertainty. Every certainty becomes unstable. Every attachment becomes visible. Every identity becomes questionable. And in that uncertainty, a hidden truth emerges. The self that claims ownership cannot survive reality unchanged. This is the next memory fragment. A hand gripping sand. The tighter it squeezes, the faster the sand escapes. The suffering is not caused by the sand. The suffering is caused by the grip. Once you see this pattern, human nature begins to look different. People chase recognition. Then become imprisoned by reputation. People pursue authority. then become terrified of losing status. People accumulate knowledge, then become unable to admit uncertainty. What begins as freedom slowly becomes dependency. What begins as power slowly becomes vulnerability. This is the paradox most people miss. The strongest chains are often made from our greatest achievements. And this insight extends far beyond individuals. Entire organizations become attached to their past victories. Entire societies become attached to old identities. Entire civilizations become attached to narratives about who they believe themselves to be. When reality changes, attachment refuses to move. The result is conflict. Not because reality is hostile. Because attachment cannot adapt. This is why the furnace archetype scales upward so naturally. At the individual level, attachment creates personal suffering. At the institutional level, attachment creates stagnation. At the civilizational level, attachment creates decline. At the spiritual level, attachment creates separation. The pattern remains identical. Only the scale changes. And now another layer of Buddhist philosophy comes into view. Awakening is not primarily the acquisition of truth. It is the release of illusion. That distinction changes everything. Most people approach transformation like collectors. Collect more knowledge. Collect more techniques. Collect more experiences. Collect more insights. But the furnace suggests a completely different direction. Transformation may have less to do with what is added, and more to do with what is released. Not accumulation. Relinquishment. Not construction. Surrender. Not becoming something else. Seeing through what was never truly there. That is our next memory fragment. A traveler carrying a heavy backpack across a desert. For years he searches for water, only to discover the weight slowing him down was never the desert. It was the backpack. And perhaps the most uncomfortable realization of all is this. Many people spend their entire lives strengthening the very structures they eventually need to transcend. Their identities. Their certainties. Their stories. Their attachments. The furnace does not condemn those structures. It simply reveals their limits. Which brings us to a final symbolic reversal. The greatest obstacle to awakening is often not weakness. It is success. Not failure. But attachment to achievement. Not ignorance. But attachment to knowledge. Not the absence of power. But attachment to power. And if that is true, then the consequences become enormous. Because the question is no longer whether an individual can survive the furnace. The deeper question is what happens after the illusion of ownership begins to crack. What becomes possible when the mind stops asking, "What can I gain?" and starts asking a far stranger question, what remains when there is nothing left to defend? When the impulse to defend begins to weaken, something unexpected happens. The furnace does not disappear. Its influence becomes visible everywhere. Because the deepest symbols are never confined to a single moment. They become patterns. They become lenses through which entire lives, institutions, and civilizations can be understood. And this is the legacy of the furnace. Not a legacy of fire. A legacy of exposure. A legacy of revealing the hidden cost of attachment. Once we understand this, the consequences become impossible to ignore. Every attachment extracts a price. Not always immediately. Not always dramatically. But inevitably. The attachment to certainty costs curiosity. The attachment to status costs authenticity. The attachment to identity costs transformation. The attachment to control costs peace. The tragedy is that most people pay these prices without realizing they are paying them. They mistake the cost for normal life. They mistake the burden for themselves. And so the pattern continues. This is why the symbolic function of the furnace extends far beyond the individual. At the personal level, attachment narrows perception. The mind begins filtering reality through preservation rather than understanding. Questions become threats. Change becomes danger. Growth becomes selective. Only the forms of growth that protect identity are welcomed. Everything else is resisted. That is the first long-term consequence. The shrinking of perception. Not because reality becomes smaller. Because the self becomes larger. Picture a window slowly covered by layers of dust. The world outside remains vast. The ability to see it does not. That is our next memory fragment. A dusty window. Not blindness. Obscured vision. The distinction matters. Because obscured vision can persist for decades while appearing perfectly normal. Now expand the scale. What happens when groups begin operating according to the same principle? The answer is history. Communities become attached to narratives. Organizations become attached to success formulas. Institutions become attached to authority. The result is remarkably consistent. Adaptation slows. Self-correction weakens. Reality becomes increasingly filtered through collective identity. And eventually a dangerous reversal occurs. The system begins protecting its image more aggressively than its purpose. That is the second major consequence. The replacement of truth with preservation. A company forgets why it was created. A movement forgets what it stood for. An institution forgets whom it serves. The form survives. The spirit fades. This is another memory fragment. An ancient lighthouse still standing on the shore. Its structure remains intact. But the light inside has gone out. The deeper tragedy is not collapse. The deeper tragedy is forgetting the original purpose before collapse arrives. And this pattern scales upward again. Civilizations often imagine that decline begins with external threats. Economic pressure. Political instability. Military competition. But the symbolic lesson of the furnace suggests something more fundamental. The greatest vulnerability appears when a civilization becomes unable to examine its own assumptions. When identity becomes sacred. When questioning becomes dangerous. When certainty becomes a substitute for wisdom. At that point, decline begins internally long before it becomes visible externally. And suddenly the furnace reveals itself not as an ancient symbol, but as a permanent law of human nature. Anything unwilling to examine itself eventually becomes trapped by itself. This applies equally to people, institutions, ideologies, and cultures. Which brings us to the spiritual legacy. The deepest consequence of attachment is not suffering alone. It is separation. Separation from reality. Separation from change. Separation from the present moment. And ultimately, separation from the possibility of genuine awakening. Not because awakening is distant, but because attachment continuously redirects attention toward protection rather than perception. Toward possession rather than presence. Toward maintenance rather than discovery. This is why the furnace remains such a powerful archetype. Its purpose is not to teach destruction. Its purpose is to reveal what cannot evolve because it cannot let go. And perhaps that is why the symbol continues to resonate centuries later. Not because people fear fire. Because people recognize themselves in what the fire reveals. The executive protecting a reputation. The scholar protecting a theory. The influencer protecting an audience. The institution protecting an image. The civilization protecting a story. Different forms. The same pattern. And yet one mystery still remains. If attachment leaves such a long shadow across individual lives, social systems, and even entire civilizations, and if the consequences of that attachment continue echoing long after the original illusion is exposed, then perhaps the most important question is no longer what the furnace reveals. Perhaps the deeper question is what becomes possible after the need to protect finally ends. What kind of freedom exists on the other side of defense itself? Perhaps the final lesson was never hidden inside the fire at all. Perhaps it was hidden inside the one who entered it. Not as a character. Not as a hero. Not as a figure from an ancient story, but as an archetype that continues to live inside every human being. Because the furnace was never merely a symbol of transformation. It was a symbol of recognition. The recognition that much of human suffering begins when we mistake what we experience for what we are. We spend years building identities, careers, beliefs, reputations, accomplishments, relationships. And there is nothing inherently wrong with any of these things. The problem begins when they stop becoming expressions of life and start becoming definitions of self. When that happens, every change feels like a threat. Every loss feels like an attack. Every uncertainty feels unbearable. Not because reality has become more dangerous. Because identity has become more fragile. And yet the strange beauty hidden within this archetype is that reality never stops inviting us beyond that fragility. Life keeps changing. People change. Cultures change. Civilizations change. Even the stories we tell ourselves change. The river keeps flowing whether we resist it or not. The question is whether we flow with it, or spend our lives trying to hold the water in our hands. That image may be the final memory fragment. A hand reaching into a river. The water cannot be owned. The moment it is grasped, it slips away. Yet when the hand opens, the river was never lost. Perhaps that is why the deepest spiritual traditions place such importance on letting go. Not because the world is meaningless, but because it is alive. And anything alive cannot be possessed permanently. This insight transforms the meaning of strength. Many people believe strength means control. Control of circumstances. Control of outcomes. Control of identity. Control of the future. But the deeper form of strength may be something else entirely. The ability to remain open in a world that never stops changing. The ability to meet uncertainty without turning it into fear. The ability to experience success without becoming trapped by it. The ability to experience loss without being destroyed by it. The ability to learn without building a throne from knowledge. The ability to act without becoming imprisoned by the actor. This is where the symbolic legacy of the furnace reaches beyond any single tradition, philosophy, or culture. It speaks to something universal. Every human being encounters moments when life asks the same question in different forms. What are you unwilling to release? What are you protecting? What are you afraid would disappear if you stop defending it? Sometimes the answer is status. Sometimes certainty. Sometimes pain. Sometimes an old story. Sometimes a version of ourselves that has long since outlived its purpose. And perhaps awakening begins not when those things are defeated, but when they are finally seen clearly. Seen without fear. Seen without judgment. Seen without the need to cling. Because what remains after attachment loosens is not emptiness. It is space. Space for reality to be experienced directly. Space for humility. Space for wisdom. Space for compassion. Space for transformation that does not need to announce itself. And maybe that is the quiet truth left behind by the furnace. Not that fire changes people. Not that suffering purifies people. Not that knowledge saves people. But that awareness creates the possibility for change. Everything else is merely circumstance. The fire may come and go. Success may come and go. Failure may come and go. Even the identities we spend years constructing may come and go. Yet something remains available beneath all of them. A freedom that does not depend on possession. A wisdom that does not depend on superiority. A peace that does not depend on control. And perhaps that leaves us with one final question. If the deepest illusion is not that we have too little, but that we must constantly defend what we think we are, then what might be waiting on the other side of a self that no longer needs defending?